scientists, and welcome back to Professor K's Science Lab. Did you miss me last week? I had to take some time off because quarantine was making me a little crazy. Today, we are going to learn about this wonderful thing right here. Can anybody tell me what this is? You're right, it's the moon. Why are we learning about the moon, you ask? That's a great question. This weekend, on May 2nd, it is National Astronomy Day. That is a special day where scientists bring astronomy to the people. What is astronomy, you ask? Astronomy is the study of the planets, the stars, everything in outer space. It is a super cool thing to learn about. And today, we are going to learn about one very small piece of outer space, the moon. Let's start by learning a little bit about the moon. What is the moon, you ask? Do you know any facts about the moon? Let me hear them. I love those facts that you said about the moon. Let's learn a little more. The moon is what we call a satellite. It is something that orbits or circles our Earth. Earth is where we live. Earth has lots of oxygen. It has lots of spaces that we can build houses and build other things on. The Earth is where we live. It's where humans live. And the moon orbits or rotates around the Earth. So just like this, the Earth is spinning, and here goes our moon around the Earth and out the other side. Now, the moon rotates the Earth about every 27 days. That's a little less than a month. And this is important because the moon also has different phases. Sometimes you may look up into the night sky and see that the moon looks different on different nights. We're going to learn about those phases a little bit later in our activity. Our moon is the 5th largest moon in the solar system. How do we know that it's the 5th largest moon in the solar system? Well, this is where astronauts come in. Astronauts are people just like you and I who love science and love outer space and go up into outer space to study all of the planets and the stars. NASA, or the National Aeronautics Space Administration, is one company that astronauts work through to go and visit outer space. NASA is very, very important to our community. It allows us to go up into space and see what's there. The United States first went to the moon in the year 1969. This was long before you and I were born. There were 3 astronauts that went up into space in the Apollo 11 space shuttle. These 3 astronauts were Mike Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. It was during their trip with the Apollo 11 space shuttle that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong decided to make a separate trip to make a lunar landing. Now, a lunar landing is when someone steps foot onto the moon. So it's just like walking on the moon. They took a special module called the lunar module, which was called the Eagle, and they took it to the moon. Now, astronaut Neil Armstrong was the first United States astronaut to step foot on the moon. But we know that he did not go on this lunar landing alone, which would make Buzz Aldrin the 2nd astronaut who stepped foot on the moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent 3 hours on the moon exploring, walking around, and conducting experiments. Is that something that you would like to do? When Professor K was a very young child, she wanted to be an astronaut too. I would love to go up to the moon. How cool would that be? It has been many, many years since an American astronaut has been back on the moon's surface. The last time that an American astronaut made a soft lunar landing was in 1972. Let's get a little more into learning about the moon. If you can see on my moon, you'll see some little circles. Those little circles are called craters. And craters are really, really cool to learn about, and something that we're going to take a look at right now. we are going to conduct a little experiment to show us how craters are formed on the moon. There are 5,185 craters on the surface of the moon. That is a ton. Some of the craters are so big that they've been named by astronauts. Craters are formed by things called asteroids, or space particles in space. Asteroids are very, very large burning rocks that crash into the side of the moon. Now, asteroids sometimes will come towards Earth, but Earth has something called an atmosphere, and our atmosphere is very, very thick. It burns up the asteroids before they can reach us here on Earth. The moon's atmosphere is very, very thin, which means it does not have the special protection like the Earth does to keep asteroids from hitting its surface. Let's conduct a little experiment to see what happens when an asteroid hits the moon. Here, I have a tray that is filled with moon dust. Okay, this moon dust was made from flour and chocolate powder. So if you would like to do this experiment at home, all you will need is a tray, some flour, and some chocolate powder if you have it. So this is my moon dust. This little ball here is my asteroid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it up in the air and I'm going to let it drop so that you can see what happens when an asteroid hits the moon. What do you think will happen? Let's make a hypothesis to see if you can tell me what's going to happen when the asteroid hits the moon dust. Did my super smart scientists think of their hypothesis? Let's see if you're right. Are you ready? I'm going to take this tennis ball, which is my asteroid, and I'm going to drop it into my pan of moon dust. Let's see what happens. You can see that my asteroid bounced just a little bit. Here on my moon dust, you will see that it made a circle. It made a dent in my moon dust. You can also see that it made a smaller circle right here. These are what we would call craters. Sometimes when the asteroid hits the moon, it will break up and form smaller craters around the big crater. The bigger the crater is, the bigger the asteroid is. Let's try one more time. Again, I'm going to bring my asteroid up high and I'm going to drop it onto my moon sand. Here you will see that it made a bigger circle, which means my asteroid traveled at a higher speed to hit my moon dust. Now that we've talked about craters on the moon, we are going to talk about the different moon phases. If you can remember, at the beginning of our science lab, I talked briefly about the different phases of the moon. Can you guess how many different phases of the moon there are? If you guessed that there were 8 phases of the moon, you were correct. Let's learn about the 8 different phases. We are going to discuss the 8 phases of the moon using a small experiment. For this experiment, you can use any type of cookie that has a hard shell on the outside and soft cream on the inside. I used Oreos. There are 2 different kinds of words that we will see while going over our phases of the moon. The first word is waxing. The second word is waning. Both words start with a W. A waxing moon means that the shadow on the moon is getting smaller and the parts of the moon that we see are getting larger. The second part of the phase of the moon that we are going to talk about is the waning moon. This means that the shadow on the moon is getting larger and the part of the moon that we see is getting smaller. It looks like the moon is shrinking. Let's talk about the 8 phases of our moon. The moon phase always starts with a new moon. To go around the entire phase of the moon, all 8 phases, it takes about a month, a little over 29 days. So again, we start with our new moon. This means that you aren't going to see any visible parts of the moon at all. You will just see a shadow. The second phase of the moon is called the waxing crescent. It looks like a moon that you may see in a book. It's a crescent shape. You'll see that the shadow is still pretty big on the moon, but we are starting to see more signs of the moon. Our third phase of the moon is called the first quarter moon. It looks like the moon is split in half. We will see half of the moon, and the other half of the moon will be in a shadow. Then we go on to our waxing gibbous moon. The shadow on the moon will look more like the crescent shape that we saw in phase 2, and the part of the moon that we see will be bigger, a little bit larger than half of the moon that we saw in phase 3. Phase 4 will be the full moon. This is when we see the entire moon. There is no shadows. It is bright and on display for all of us to see. Then we go on to our waning moon, which means the moon shadow is coming back. Then we go on to the 7th phase of the moon, which is the last quarter. You can see that it is opposite of our first quarter moon. And then we go on to the waning crescent moon. We see that crescent shape again, but this time our shadow is on the opposite side of the moon. And the part of the moon that we see is going away. After the waning crescent moon, about the end of the month, we come back to our new moon. So if you can do this experiment at home, it is really, really fun. And you get to eat cookies in the process, which is fabulous. Now it's time for a review. Can anyone tell me what this is? If you said this is the moon, you are correct. Today we learned about the moon because National Astronomy Day is this coming weekend on Saturday, May 2nd. We learned about NASA and 3 astronauts that did the first American moon landing. Can you name one of the 3 astronauts? If you said Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, or Mike Collins, you are correct. All right, scientists, let's talk about these circles that you see on the moon. Can anyone tell me what those large circles are called? If you said a crater, you're right. You are super smart. If you remember, we conducted an experiment with an asteroid, or my tennis ball, and our moon dust. We saw what happened when our asteroid hit the plate of moon dust. It made a large circle, which is called a crater. Can you remember how many phases there are to our moon? If you said 8 phases, you're right again. There are 8 phases that our moon goes through within the span of 1 month. I hope that you had a lot of fun learning about the moon. And as always, Professor K loves to end her science lab with a joke. Are you ready? Why wasn't the moon hungry? Because it was full. I'm Professor K, and I want to thank you for joining me in Professor K's Science Lab. I hope you have an out of this world day.